starting off, we should kind of get acquainted with who you were at Yavapai College and when you started here. What year did you start?
I started in 1981.
Okay.
And I came here I'd worked at a little college in La Junta, Colorado prior to that, but came here in 1981 as an instructor of psychology and sociology, are my two main fields.
Okay. What brought you to Yavapai College or Prescott besides the job?
Well, we had been through the area. We liked to camp out. And during my summer vacations, we often came to the south, this part of the Southwest, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, on camping trips, and we really liked the area, and thought this would be an ideal place to live. We had young children, and thought this would be a good place to have our family. Where I was in Colorado, we were on the high plains of eastern Colorado, which is kind of indistinguishable from Kansas.
Mm-hmm. Been there.
The summers were hot, and the winters were cold, and we were there 11 years, but this just seemed like a good place to come. And I was really wanting to get back into teaching. I had at the college I was at, I had gravitated into an administrative post. I was a director of a child development services program, and although I enjoyed that, I really felt that I would be more effective as a teacher, and that unless someone died at the school I was at, it didn't look like I was ever going to get one of the teaching slots, and so this was one of the schools I applied to, and was accepted and happily came here to be an instructor. I actually took a cut in pay to come here, but
oh, did you?
But it was worth it to get into full-time instruction, which is really what I wanted to do. It's ironic that I ended up finishing as an assistant dean, but where I wasn't doing as much instruction, but most of my career was in the classroom.
Okay. What was the pay scale generally like for teachers back in Yavapai College in '81?
I think my first contract was for $19,000, which is by today's standards not great. Actually, it wasn't great back then, but it was enough to, we bought a house, although we had a down payment from selling a house in Colorado and stuff, but it was marginally enough to live on, and over the years it improved somewhat. I think my last, when I left here, what I would have been making as a teacher was about $50,000. I was making somewhat more than that because I was administrator, but so the pay scale, we were one of the lowest paid faculties in the state. Almost during my whole career here, we just never could seem to catch up. But there are rewards for doing what you want to do, and also I always enjoyed having my summers off, which I considered a benefit. But anyhow, that's.
Now, when was your last year at Yavapai College?
I retired 4 years ago, so that would have been 2003.
Okay.
And I've actually have taught at least one class up through this year. I taught a class in January of this year in that short session between the fall and spring semesters. I taught a social problems class, and after I retired, I often taught two classes. I teach social problems in the winter session, and in early summer session I teach technology and human values. So I still maintain some contact with the college.
So for that, and it's quite a stint as a teacher here. You've worked through probably a few administrations. What was the administration like when you first started? Was that
when I first got here, I thought it was kind of the ideal situation. There's a fellow, he died some years ago. His name was Joe Russo, was the president. And what I really liked about the college, I was coming from an institution where the college president was what I would, I guess, refer to as a benevolent despot. He ruled with an iron fist, if you will, but he was fair and congenial and honest, and had, I think, the best interest of the institution. He wasn't looking at it for his own aggrandizement, and I had always liked the president and the key administrators, but when I came here, Dr. Russo was, I guess, a bit more laid back. He didn't have the feeling that he had to be in charge of everything or make every decision. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the faculty, through the faculty association, was very much involved in revising and even creating policy, and always in conjunction with the administration. There was a lot of faculty involvement in planning and that sort of thing. And it felt really good, and I got on some committees and felt really that we could be effective. And it wasn't that the faculty were trying to run the show, but the faculty had, I think, a real voice in establishing some of the key rules of the road at the school. And so for the first several years I was here, I felt really good about not only being a teacher, but being part of an active, effective faculty that could be heard. And that really was one of the things, other than the fact they offered me a job, that brought me here, was that kind of feeling of being part of a real viable, cooperative kind of institution. It got worse after that.
Yeah, and how did it get worse? Was Walker the next president?
Yeah, President Walker came in, and I don't remember the year. It probably was around 1984, 85, mid-'80s anyhow. And he was much more authoritarian. Tried to create the impression that the faculty were involved. I remember faculty, after a while, after serving on certain key committees, resigned and basically said they were tired of being cardboard cutouts in committees that were just a facade for doing what the administration wanted to do without listening to faculty. And at one point, and I don't even remember what the specific issue was, but the faculty association had developed a very, I think, thorough and comprehensive input into a particular policy that we felt was important, and it had to do with working conditions and so on. And the vice president, who was working for Dr. Walker, came out with what the finished policy was. It did not incorporate or even acknowledge a single faculty concern. And when this was Dr. Birmingham, when he was asked, well, what about the faculty input? And he says, well, I looked at your input and chose to ignore it. And actually told the faculty that. And some years later, I guess a year or two later, there was a faculty newsletter, and I asked the vice president if I could reprint a article that we had published in a previous one, because we were rehashing some concerns, and he said he'd prefer that I not do it. And I went ahead, I was the editor, I went ahead and published it, and he called and asked me why, and I told him that I heard his concern and chose to ignore it. And so I would try and remember those things and try to feed them back, and he just couldn't understand how I could do that.
Well, we don't always see things from the other person's perspective.
Yeah, and so I tried to give him the feeling that the faculty had when possibly he could have been more diplomatic in the way he told us. But people don't like to be ignored, and that was one of the things that became an issue with Dr. Walker, is that not only ignoring faculty input, but just basically lying about things. I don't want to be entirely negative, but one of the reasons we have the performance hall here, which is, I think, a decent facility and everything, but that was presented to the community as the outcome of a facilities committee that had faculty on it, and the facilities committee had never recommended a performance hall. I talked to every member of the committee, and I found their final recommendations. And on the final recommendations, after they were made and after the committee was disbanded, the president, in his own handwriting, had written in a performance hall as the first recommendation of the committee, and then submitted that to the community, and actually got a bond issue passed and built the facility, ignoring faculty advice to make it handicap accessible, which later cost several $100,000s to fix when the school was ordered to make it handicap accessible. I mean, he couldn't even listen to that kind of input, that we said, you're building this facility, you have to make it handicap accessible, and he basically said, no, I don't, and they built it, and then later had to come back and fix it. It's that sort of arrogance that ends up costing the institution, and not only in terms of morale when people are ignored, but it actually costs the institution a lot of money, and that was the sort of administration that Walker ran, and finally he got run out of town, when the community also kind of picked up on what he was doing. And it was in the late 80s. I don't remember the year. I think it was 89 or so.
But then the next administrator wasn't...
we were just excited when Dr. Daly came on board. I was a psychologist. She came in as she was a clinical psychologist. And I had high hopes and worked very hard to cooperate with her and the faculty were very suspicious of any administration, and I tried to tell people we've got to trust this person and work with her because she's our best hope, and she came in saying all the right things, and then ended up having an administrative style that created what I felt was a hostile work environment. I know a number of people who retired early because I just didn't want to work under her anymore. I was one of those, and I retired at 59. I probably would have stayed around another couple of years, but I just felt that I just didn't like being in the environment that her administration created, so I left. And it seems to me that since she's gone, a year after I left, faculty voted no confidence in her, something I had been encouraging them to do for years, and they invited me back for the meeting where that happened, so I felt kind of good about that. And I think things have gotten a lot better since then, but the school, one of the things I think is a credit to the faculty is that even when we were having our ups and downs with what we considered to be authoritarian administrators, that the quality of instruction at the school, I don't believe, ever suffered. In fact, I think it may have improved because people, instead of investing their energies in a lot of the kind of work that I think is important and valuable, trying to participate in the governance, if you will, of the institution, a lot of people just focused exclusively on their instruction because they knew that they wouldn't be listened to elsewhere, and so they poured their efforts into being the best teachers they could be, and didn't even, many of them even just kind of gave up trying to be more involved in the institution, which I think is unfortunate because I think faculty, if an institution is not using the expertise and experience of its faculty, it's losing an incredible body of knowledge and so on that could help the institution operate.
Yeah, I actually heard something about when they're redesigning the quad and some buildings that Yavapai College actually has an instructor who's renowned for his architecture and designing. But and he said he could create a proposal and involve students and make it an educational thing for everyone. But the old administration still went with an outside source and spent oodles of more money.
Oh yeah, that was just sort of typical. And we have lots of meetings where the faculty would provide input, and that input was basically ignored. I mean, there would be lip service. One of the things that faculty had always enjoyed was having their offices close to their teaching areas, where they felt they were more accessible to students, and that sort of thing. And the administration said, well, we want to put all the offices in one place because that's really efficient. And the faculty, as a group, I mean, virtually, it wasn't unanimous, but I think a majority of faculty said we really would like to have our offices closer to where we teach. And as it was finally built, all the offices were stuck in one central area.
That students are hesitant to go back into.
It's sort of a labyrinth of offices, and I don't know. It was done after I left. I don't know the effect, but it was just another example of how faculty concerns were totally ignored for the most part. And we had a decade, or actually probably 15 years, of faculty being belittled. One of the things with both Walker and Daley is that they not only ignored faculty, but their administrations consistently belittled faculty and essentially suggested that faculty were childish and wanting to take over the institution, when in fact we just wanted to be part of it. And I always, even though I was heavily involved, I was faculty association president 3 different times, which I think is a record. I think one other person did it 3 times, because it's often not a fun position. One year when Dr. Walker was here, he had come up with what he considered to be this fantastic planning process, and he was going to involve faculty and all that, and faculty were, after some experience with him, were somewhat skeptical. And in fact, the day I had gone in for a meeting with him, and he told me about this, some details of his new planning program and so on. And it was within that week that the Faculty Association at our next meeting voted to boycott any planning process implemented by the president of the institution. And we actually did for 2 years. And initially, the administration and the board kind of scoffed at us as well, we don't need you, and that sort of thing. At the end of the second year, they were begging the faculty to get back involved because they realized they couldn't do it themselves. And that was one of the years I mentioned, trying to maintain a sense of humor. They used to have retreats where the administration, the board, and a couple of key faculty and representatives of the other employee organizations also would go down and they talk about things. I borrowed a Vietnam-era flak jacket and carried a big briefcase to the meeting, and when it was time for the faculty report, I got my briefcase out, got the flak jacket on, put it on, buttoned it up, and then gave the Faculty Association report to the board. A couple of whom were actually mildly amused, and I think some of them were offended, but I felt it was appropriate to kind of I didn't say anything nasty. I just put on my flak jacket and gave my report and sat down. And occasionally I would like to do something theatrical, and I thought somewhat amusing to maybe break the tension, because there was a lot of tension at some of these meetings where it was obvious that the board at that time was being fed a lot of vitriol about faculty, and were very nasty sometimes to faculty.
So did a lot of these, I guess, fights or conflicts arise out of curriculum choices? Because I was told that you did go to the mat a few times over curriculum and how things should be taught.
Yeah, there were times when we were being pushed to use some of the alternative delivery methods, for example, when they were still not very effective. I'm still not entirely convinced how effective some of the online stuff is, but at one point we were giving, for several classes in social sciences, we were giving pre-tests and post-tests, where we would have a kind of a standard list of questions relating to course content. And at one point, at this time I was the division chair, and so I was sort of monitoring this stuff for other instructors. And we actually had one of the classes that was taught online where the students did worse on the post-test than they did on the pre-test after having an online course. And I would never hesitate to bring that up when they were pressuring us to do more classes along those lines, because of I felt that I would hear students talk about take the online course, they're real easy, because you don't require to do as much stuff. Now I don't know that's the case with every course or whatever, but some of the online courses had developed a reputation for being an easy A, because of some of the limitations of the technology. The instructor-student interaction was limited, and so on. But there were times when courses were approved. I know in my area, I can't speak too generally, but the Dean of Instruction one year approved what should have been probably a senior level course to be taught here that I felt was inappropriate to be taught at community college. I felt students who took the course would probably have trouble transferring it, because it was a course that most universities had as a junior or senior level course, and I argued against it, and it was approved. And so there were times when that sort of thing would happen again, where the administration would simply make a judgment and kind of ignore the input of faculty, and even faculty, division chairs and this sort of thing. So we had, although that's the bad news, but in general, I felt the one committee that worked pretty consistently, even when we had all the problems with the administration, was the curriculum committee. I think all the committees functioned reasonably well. I think the curriculum committee probably was the most effective committee overall in having and maintaining the faculty control, at least largely control of the curriculum. There were some instances, I think, where the committee was overruled, but in general, throughout that entire time, in my whole tenure here, I felt really good about what the curriculum committee did, and the integrity they showed and the expertise they showed with monitoring the development of new courses and changes of existing courses and so on. So I don't want to give there were some times when there were negative things happening, but and sometimes it got to be again we played with one another. I was responsible for initiating the course in human sexuality, and prior to that, and this was actually one of the times when old Joe Russo was president. They could never have a course with the term human and dealing with sex in the title. Prior to that, they had a course on the biology of human reproduction, which was not quite the same thing. And I and another instructor were going to team teach a class as a woman, and myself were going to team teach it, figuring that a male-female couple would probably be able to cover most of the perspectives on human sexuality. We developed this course, and I went to Dr. Walker and said, I want to introduce a course in human sexuality, and there have been some problems with this in the past, and are you going to have a problem with it? And to his credit, he kind of laughed and said, "Why would I have a problem with it?" And some of the faculty, when I took it to, we had to defend our course when we wanted to add a new course. You would go and defend it to the curriculum committee. And it was approved, but I got questions like, what kind of homework were we going to assign, and would there be position papers, and a little bit of humor, I think, showing some of the discomfiture with the subject. But it was approved, and the class is taught, and I think it's still being. I think it's still part of the curriculum. This is back in the early 80s, and so. I think there's a tendency for us to sometimes focus on the bad experiences we had, like with administrators or whatever, but most of the time, particularly with curriculum and instruction, where things worked fairly well. It was some of the other areas dealing with policy issues and working conditions. I mean, we had a heck of a time even defining what a faculty job description was, and we went around and around with that for a couple of years. And it was just very difficult because the faculty had certain things they wanted included, and the administration had certain things they wanted included, and sometimes we didn't see eye to eye on those, and it took us a long time. And I think eventually we got some workable, stuff, set down, but it was sometimes difficult, and just showing our different approaches.
Well, you've still maintained, as you said, a little bit of contact with the school after your retirement.
I have a lot of friends here.
Yeah. What are your inklings, or do you feel that the new administration is working things out in a better way, and or have they improved in your mind?
My impression,
the problems?
And our biggest complaint, and that I think that I could sum it up with both the Walker and Daley administration, was they didn't listen. Sometimes they pretended to listen, but they never really listened, and I think that was to the detriment of the institution. And what I hear about the new administration is that the president and his key people listen. And even though, and there are built-in differences in perspectives between administrators and faculty, and that's a given. I mean, that doesn't mean anyone's a bad person, that they have a different perspective. But I think the key problem we had previously was we didn't have the feeling that we could even make our case, and that we could be listened to, and that we could have honest disagreements. If we disagreed, we were characterized as kind of the enemy. And my impression, and I haven't been working here, but I've been talking with people who do, and my impression is that even though there, some of the disagreements that are inherent in faculty administrative roles, that the current administration is more willing to listen and really listen, not just pay lip service, and that the faculty that I've talked to feel much better about the viewpoints, the operation, approach, however you want to say it, of the current administration. And the hope is that can be continued. I know that the current president doesn't plan on staying forever, but I'm hoping that kind of mindset can be continued, because that's when I first arrived here, there was just a real feeling of comfort. I mean, we during the first week of school, when we had all these meetings and stuff, there was a lot of faculty input into what would go on, and we even had faculty baseball games and stuff like that. I mean, we'd have fun together, and in later years, we would just sit through meetings. And I once, I know Dr. Daley's approach was to keep bringing in inspirational speakers, I guess, to inspire us. And one year, I just, after about our fourth year of inspirational speakers during our first week back, I said, one more inspirational speaker, and I'm going to kill someone. Obviously in jest, but I was getting tired of people trying to inspire me in a hostile work environment. there was just such a disconnect with these people coming in and talking about how the world can be wonderful and how we can love each other and all of this. And you knew that when he left, everything was going to be the same, and so people got to be just cynical about, well, I wonder who the speaker is going to be, what pie in the sky stuff are they going to be selling us this year, and each year it was some new thing to inspire us and motivate us, when what we really wanted was just something with a friendly work environment.
Mm-hmm. So, well, over your years, as a teacher and administrator, just a faculty member here, besides the kind of the administration and faculty, what have you noticed that's changed, or anything that stands out about like the student body, as far as racial change, or even like the motivations of students? Anything stand out as something that's...
I don't know, every year they seem to get younger. I guess that was because I was getting older. Everyone comments on that. This has always been, as near as I can tell, pretty much a white community, and the school has reflected that. We've always had a small but I think important population of Native American students, and very little in the way of other minorities. Occasionally some black students will be in the community, but there just aren't that many folks in the community. I think the one thing that has changed, and I think for the better, is over the years there's been more recognition that there needs to be more support for students from different backgrounds, and I think that the services for students and the resources for students from a variety of backgrounds has improved. That's just an impression. I don't have any statistics on it. I think that we've always had a large proportion of our student body have been part-time students, and I think that with the growth of the college, there's been a lot of emphasis on having the satellite centers that are involving even more part-time students, and I think that we've always had an older student body and a part-time, and of course the traditional students, the 18 to 20 something students, have always been an important, I think, minority, actually, if you will, of the student body, because so many of our students are returning students, reentry students, whatever we want to call them, and I think that's good. Some of the dullest classes I ever taught were populated by only traditional students, and it's just hard to get the interaction. I always like to get discussion and so on, and get a variety of viewpoints. It's hard to get a variety of viewpoints if you've just got a small segment. And I think my best classes, and usually this was the case, I'd have a mix where I would have my traditional age students, and then I'd have people in their 30s and older, and even sometimes in their 60s and 70s. And sometimes the 60 and 70-year-old students would be bringing in life experiences and points of view that younger students have never been exposed to. And so I think that the kind of mix we have, and I can't really put my finger on the exact proportions, but I think that the maintenance of a healthy older student population has been really important to maintain kind of the vitality of the institution. I think the average age of our student, when you figure our entire student body, the part-time in addition to full-time, because our full-time students tend to be more the younger students coming out of high school and that sort of thing. Oh God, I think I've lost my train of thought here.
Well, I think they're like the average age is around 25.
I think the average age is in the mid-30s.
Oh, is it?
That's that's where I was going. Average age, yeah. If you check it, I remember one year, and I don't know what it is now, where the average age was like 34.
Wow.
Students, which was much older than you would think, but it's because of our part-time population, and so it'd be something you could check on. I don't know what it is now, but I know it was always higher than what people would think it was if you just looked around campus during the day.
Yeah.
But you look at the evening classes, and you got a lot, and there's a lot of people taking evening classes. In fact, I think the part-time students have always outnumbered the full-time students, and that's important, I think, for the kind of mix that you want at a community college.
Well, in your defense, a lot of the students are getting younger. Because now they have a lot of high school students taking classes.
Yeah, the Upward Bound kind of program.
And then now that we have the Dudley Webb Family Enrichment Center, which all those students are like 2 to 5.
Yeah, and that I was once.
And there's students here.
Yeah, I was once reprimanded for. Oh golly, it was during the Walker administration. Students of, we've always had enough students with children that really wanted to have some kind of facility that might be able to help provide some daycare on a limited basis for children, and I was in contact with an administrator at the VA hospital next door, and they have a lot of facilities there, some of which weren't being used. And this administrator actually made an offer that we'll provide you with a facility for free if you can man it in as some sort of teaching school, whatever. And it's another one of those things where the administration just totally ignored it because it was not their idea, apparently. And I wrote a letter at the behest of these students to the board, and I found that I had committed one of the cardinal sins, and that a mere faculty member is not supposed to communicate directly with the board. And I received a formal letter of reprimand in my file from Dr. Walker for jumping the chain of command and having the audacity to talk with a board member, and they had to settle the board member down about, because I basically accused the administration of dragging their feet on this issue, and they basically dragged their feet for another 15 years, and now we finally have this center here. So I feel gratified that before I came here, I was in charge of a child development program for 7 years, and felt it was important, and I thought it could be done. And finally, and it was during Daly's administration actually, that there was a child development coordinator brought on board, and there was a Head Start collaboration with Head Start, particularly in the Verde Valley. But there was never a center that was, focused specifically on students who had children here. And I was on the advisory board for the Head Start operation and so on. But finally, I guess if you hang around long enough, and if an idea has merit, eventually it may trickle up. And I was really quite gratified when that became part of the plan and now is part of the institution. But I took some hits over that back in probably about 1986 when I suggested, 21 years ago, when I suggested that the administration ought to put more focus on trying to provide that service, because we had such a high proportion of students with children, and just could not get anyone to listen.
Yeah. Well, I don't know when it happened, but I heard a story about an administrator that found a young child in a car in the parking lot while, so that the mother could go to class.
Ooh, that's,
So there's got to be a need.
Yeah. Oh, there was a need. And I've had times when I had mothers with young children in my class, and when the babysitter had crapped out or something, and I would let them, I sometimes would supply materials if they didn't have any. Usually they'd bring stuff, and then have a little 5-year-old kid in the back of the room drawing pictures or something while I was, doing a class on sociology or psychology, and occasionally that would happen, and I would allow, as long as the child wasn't disrupting the class. It was always obvious that it was a need, but sometimes it was, and it's a cost issue. I mean, administrators saw this as a cost rather than as an important, necessary service. And I was dumbfounded when they refused to even consider talking to someone who was willing to offer us a free facility. And admittedly, there are a lot of requirements that have to be met for such a facility. But it seemed that if you have a free space, that bringing it up to the requirements would have been a doable proposition. But that administration just totally ignored it. Finally, I think it worked its way in because we did have eventually the Child Development Training Program in conjunction with Head Start, and more people who were willing to push for it, and people in the community who saw that and were willing to push for it. But that was one that was very near and dear to me because I had taken a pretty nasty hit in my personnel file after Dr. Walker left, and we had an interim president who was a previous dean. I formally requested to have the letter removed, and she took it out. But so it was no longer in my file, but it was in my file for 3 or 4 years, and about basically how I was insubordinate, and which I probably was, but I just did not have it be a matter of official record. I was frequently insubordinate.
You weren't that proud of it.
But, well, I was, I felt that I did the right thing, and it was one of the things where no good deed will go unpunished. And at one point it was, I was actually lurking around campus putting up little signs that said the floggings will continue until morale improves. And
I've seen one of those signs around
really?
campus.
Oh, okay.
I can't remember where it is, but
well, I spent a number of months. I'd put them up on the president's office door and executive restrooms, and it was just sort of a game. I mean, we'd let them know that people were not necessarily happy. I don't think they ever figured out who did it. It's the first time I publicly admitted it.
I think the statute of limitations might have run out on that.
I think it's been a long time, but that's about as bad as it ever got. I know Dr. Walker accused faculty of releasing mice in her office, for God's sake, and trying to sabotage her. I don't think any faculty would ever have done. I think we stopped at putting up silly little postings, but she actually accused faculty of threatening her life and stuff like that. I mean, that's how bad it got.
Well, that was around the time that Animal House came out. Maybe she got some ideas from that.
But apparently there was a mouse in her office, and if there was something bad in there, the faculty must have done it. That was one of those. It was funny. I mean,
wow.
But I remember another instance to kind of show the distinction between faculty and employees and administrators. There was a piece of equipment stolen. I think it was a radio. And it was determined that someone had a key to get into the room where it was, and so the administration wanted to give all of the support personnel, janitorial and maintenance and all that, lie detector tests.
Wow.
As a psychologist, the American Psychological Association is on record opposed to the use of lie detectors for that sort of purpose. They're very unreliable and all that. And of course, no administrators were going to be subjected to lie detectors, although there were a whole bunch of administrators had keys to those facilities. And when they announced it, I sent an open memo around to everyone stating the American Psychological Association position on the use of lie detectors for such purposes, and suggesting that people refuse to submit themselves to these. And after that, the backed off on subjecting people to lie detectors. I suspect they weren't terribly happy with me, but I felt that they were going to be engaging in a witch hunt. I think they eventually caught who there was someone stealing, but I just felt that subjecting everyone to that sort of demeaning and unreliable technology was inappropriate, and so I frequently felt it was my position or duty to let people know that they had some rights and that they shouldn't let the administration tread on those rights and stuff. But that was one of those instances where I think the administration tried to operate in a high-handed fashion, and with most bullies, they backed down when they were challenged.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also I've heard about a lot of your life experience that you do bring as a teacher. You were a translator during the Vietnam War.
Not a translator. I was a linguist,
Okay.
and basically was a spy. I worked in a facility where we spied on the Chinese radio communications and so on. It's been long enough. I don't think it would surprise anyone that during the Vietnam War, we were intercepting radio communications from China. And so my official title was I was a voice intercept processing specialist, and I think that title suggests what that was. But I am I was never in Vietnam, but I'm a Vietnam era veteran. I had friends that went to Vietnam. My best friend was killed in Vietnam. But I worked as a suicide counselor when I was in college, and introduced a course here in suicide and crisis intervention that was taught over a fair number of years. When I introduced it here, there had just been a rash of teenage suicides in the community during that time. Again, it was in the late 80s. There were 3 or 4 suicides in the same high school one year.
Wow.
And there was a lot of community interest, and I introduced a course in suicide and crisis intervention. And initially, the first few years, it was really heavily attended. It kind of petered out after that, but I felt that it was at least responding to a community need at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I've worked as a deputy sheriff.
Wow.
Some of my background is, at the same time I was working at the college in Colorado, I was working as a reserve officer for the sheriff's department, carried a gun, badge, and all that stuff. So I enjoyed bringing in some of those experiences. The military has some military background, crisis work, police work. When I taught sociology classes, I felt that some of that real-life experience, and of course what I did in the child development area it was actually a poverty program. It was a federally funded poverty program. Essentially it was a Head Start, a program we called child development centers, which worked with very young children, infant stimulation. And then we had a handicap children's program, and it was all federally funded, so I had a lot of experience working with federal bureaucracy. One of my favorite stories I would tell when you wonder why government sometimes is so out of touch or so expensive is one year we were audited. This is an experience here, but it's something in my background. Mm-hmm. One year we were audited, and the auditors, we had roughly $1 million grant. Running our child development. We had centers in 3 counties, served over 300 families, had a staff of about 60, so it was a pretty good sized program. And the auditor sent a letter to what at that time was Health, Education, and Welfare, it's HEW, now it's Health and Human Services, asking them to confirm that they had sent us $1 million the previous year to operate our program, and HEW sent them a letter back, actually put it in writing that they had no mechanism for accounting for amounts of money that small. Would they please just ask us if we got it? And that was one of those stories, that really worked out nicely in sociology and social problems.
No, could you send another check?
Yeah, right. So we didn't get it. Send us another one. But when you talk about issues with bureaucracies and so on, that kind of and I had lots of other experiences with the federal government. I got to the point where, I'd say the three great lies were, like the check is in the mail, I'll respect you in the morning, and I'm a Fed and I'm here to help you. And that was one of our standing jokes. 'Cause sometimes dealing with the Feds was a really scary proposition. And apparently still is. You hear the stuff with Katrina and all of that. Well, it's not gotten a whole lot better. This was back in the 1970s, and they considered $1 million too small an amount of money to track. Well, you can imagine what that does in a bureaucracy. And I always did units on bureaucracy in my sociology classes, and I'd bring up that when you get just to a certain size, that sometimes, and that's the problem right now with the war in Iraq, or billions of dollars, you have no idea where it went, and it's inherent in the bureaucracy. But unless you've worked in a large bureaucracy and seen it from the inside, it's just textbook stuff. And so I always tried to bring in my various experiences, and since I was teaching socially related classes, sociology and psychology, dealing with human behavior, I felt that kind of the variety of life experience that I had was helpful.
Yeah. Well, as a part of the honors program, we're also interested in honors program topics. But Brent Roberts has told me that you went on a trip with them to Europe. To Greece, right?
Greece and Italy.
Greece and
One of the high points of my life, actually. I think it's the first time, other than being overseas in the military, I've been able to, the only time I've been to Europe, I guess, and I felt really pleased. Brent was taking a group of, 20, 25 students and some chaperones, and asked me if I would go, and I thought it over for about a millisecond, and said sure, and was able to arrange for my wife to go too. I mean, I had to pay full fare for her to go, but we were able to buy our way in, buy her way in, so that we could go as kind of a chaperoning couple, if you will. And this, I think, was the first foreign travel that the honors program did. Prior to that, they had typically gone to California, LA, or San Francisco. San Francisco may be another country, but I think it was the first time, I think, Brent, we really kind of broke that ground on taking the honors students out of the country.
There was also one of an incident that you're, I think, the only participant of. You, in the honors program travel histories, you got rolled by gypsies.
Oh, yes, I got rolled by gypsies, yes. And, in Rome, I didn't actually get anything. I had some papers in my pocket that are inconsequential, but there was apparently a bulge in my pocket. And what was funny was I got, not really rolled, but I got pickpocketed by what was probably a 19-year-old woman carrying a baby. And you can't really hit a 19-year-old woman carrying a baby, even if she has her hand in your pocket. Kind of thing. I think I yelled at her and pushed back or something, and she took off. But it was actually, there were two women, one of them carrying a baby, that kind of accosted me, and were kind of had their hands on me and talking at me rapidly in Italian, which I do not understand. And one of them had her hand in my pocket. Yeah, so I guess I have the distinction on that trip of being accosted by what I was told were gypsies. That at least was a stereotype, but otherwise it was a wonderful trip. I remember wandering around the Acropolis, and I'd been giving presentations, in Western Civ and technology and human values on the Greek and Roman architecture, and I remember kind of wandering around saying, "My God, it's almost like really being here." Just was in sort of a daze of being able to visit, the Acropolis in Athens, and going out to Olympia and many of the other sites that I had only read about, and so on. And I took a lot of pictures and actually incorporated a lot of that material into future presentations where I could show pictures of the architecture and talk about how that was part of the culture and so on. But so that trip actually, right up until the last time I taught Western Civ, or not Western Civ, but Technology and Human Values, which I continue to teach every year. This is the first year I haven't now. I've always incorporated that material, so that was something that lived on for many years in my presentations. But that was a fantastic experience. We had
I bet.
a good time, had a lot of wonderful food in the different places that we stayed, and met, just our guides were great, and wandering around Pompeii was something I'd read about, but to actually be there in the buildings and so on in Pompeii, and hearing, seeing the oven where our guide talked about, I had read one of the historical accounts. I think it was maybe, I forget now the name, Pliny the Younger, someone had a first-hand account of a baker who had escaped and kind of bemoaned the fact that he left 88 loaves of bread in the oven, and then to be in Pompeii and have the guide say, that when this was excavated, they found 88 carbonized loaves of bread in this oven.
Wow.
That are on display in their museum.
Wow.
And just, to be there and kind of relate that to some of these things that were, part of what the historical record, and walking the actual ground and so on. And I think that was a great trip for the students. I mean, it was fun, and we almost missed our plane getting out of Rome and a few things like that. But we arrived at the airport like 20 minutes before our flight was supposed to leave, with like 20 people that had to go through customs and everything. It was they got us through the lines really fast and all that. There was a little bit of a foul up on timing, but. For that, for years after that, we always called Brent because the guy, for some reason, decided he was Brett and not Brent, and always talked to him. So he was always Brett.
He told me to bring the story about rolling the Gypsies. I'll just go back and start calling him Brett.
Yes, if you do that, he'll appreciate it, I'm sure. But I think the real significance of that trip was it really did, it expanded the honors program activities to where the foreign travel. Right after 9/11, there was that got curtailed, but I think it's probably been reinstituted since then.
Well, we had this year there was the potential to go out of the country, but there's a young lady in the class who's from Africa, and her visa won't allow her to leave the country, and we can't leave anybody behind.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
But
and that I think is, and I've talked to faculty who just couldn't understand why we want to take students out of the country, and I am kind of going like, how can you say that? This is one of the most. This was a broadening experience for me, and I'd lived out of the country for 2.5 years when I was in the service, and saw a lot of different culture and so on, and for students to have that opportunity, even if it is just for this is for like 5 days or something, or maybe a week, that it's an incredibly important thing just to get to see how other people are living and what they do, and a little bit on maybe what they think. And stuff. I think, especially now with America, I think losing some of its prestige because of the war in Iraq, to appreciate that not everyone sees things the way we do, and so on, can be a very important aspect of one's education. Yeah. So I think the honors program in general, with the kinds of activities you engage in, and then the travel, and particular are incredibly important. And the administration, again, one of the things I have to give Walker and Daly credit for is that they supported the honors program and allowed for funds to be provided to, I mean, there were fundraising, and the students always raised a good part of their expenses, or at least tried to, but there were always funds provided through the institution. Sometimes through departments would have some monies that they weren't going to be expended, but the administration would allow that to occur and always approved it. I know I always tried to help if we had any money that wasn't going to be expended in the liberal arts area, but it always had to be signed off by the president, and the president always signed off on it. So again, where it's always a mixed bag, you know. You know, there's no one is ever entirely negative, and no situation is ever entirely negative.
Yeah. Well, very few people in America own their own passport, so it's good that, you know, I've seen that
just having to get a passport, and what that entails and what it allows you to do is important, as you say. And most Americans, I don't think, have passports.
I'm pretty proud of the stamps that I have on my passport.
Yeah. Since then, I know, Brent turned it over to Catherine Reisdorfer for a number of years, and she made it a point to, I think it was on an every other year thing. One year they'd stay in country, and the next year they'd go for foreign travel, and it got disrupted after 9/11, but hopefully he's gotten back on track. That really got it started, and I think that was one of the real innovations in the program that Brett was able to initiate and maintain.
Yeah. Well, it went to Dr. Fisher for a while, and then now this year's Brent is now
back.
Has the reins again.
Yeah, that's right. I guess Catherine did it for a number of years, and then Will for probably a shorter period. I don't know how long he had it.
I'm not sure myself.
Yeah, but I think it's a great program. I know occasionally instructors would be asked to come and do a presentation, and be, discussions and so on with students, and I think it was something different, away from just the routine kind of class activities.
Yeah, different colloquiums for discussing different thoughts. I mean, that's the basic idea that that we've been going through with this year. This is my first and probably only year in the program. But yeah, Catherine Reisdorfer and Debbie Roberts came and actually talked to us about doing the interviews and what to kind of go through and some steps.
Because they've had, Catherine in particular has done a lot of work when they had the portfolio process. Was really active, and there was a lot of working with students and getting students to do projects and sometimes interviews and that sort of thing there. So it'd be valuable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've discussed some other things about changes at Yavapai College. What have you noticed about like the physical buildings? What has changed about the campus? I know more campuses have been added, but
yeah. When I interviewed for the position, when I came here in 1981, Don C., who was the chair of the committee, I don't know if you'll be talking to him or not, or someone well. He's a real old timer here. But I was going to be driving from Arizona, and the directions were, when you came in off the highway and got onto Sheldon, there would be a street, and he says you can't miss it. It looks like a prison up on the hillside. All these gray institutional buildings with just lots of concrete, almost nothing growing, so on, and that was my initial description of the place. Was it looks like a prison.
Sounds very Chinese.
And I think it looks much less like a prison now. I think changes that have been wrought. The building of the performance hall, I think, was, even though there's some controversy about it in terms of the truthfulness of the president and getting it instilled as a bond issue, I think has been a positive, if not costly, addition to the institution. But this latest round of changes, and one of the reasons, it's not that I'm against performance hall, but at that time most of the recommendations from faculty were to improve the infrastructure. I mean, we had buildings where the air conditioning didn't work, and classrooms were sometimes very hot and very cold, and they tended to focus on, why don't we improve the classroom instructional spaces, and that finally happened with the latest round of the bond issue under Dr. Daly. Again, something you have to give her credit for. And I think the campus for many years was in kind of a state of decline. Roofs leaked. You'd come into the library after a rain, and there'd be wastebaskets and buckets, here and there'd be places in hallways, and in some classrooms, instructors knew you couldn't put certain things up on the wall because when it rained, that wall would get wet, and stuff. And we lived with that for another decade after the Walker administration. And now, I'll have to admit, I'm really impressed when I come on campus. The science building had an upper and a lower floor, and no interior way of getting from the upper to the lower to the upper floor. You had to go outside and walk up a set of exposed stairs. If you had a class on the base, on the first floor, and then had to go up to the second floor of the same building. I don't even understand how that made it through building codes and stuff. And there was never, talk about handicap accessibility. They had the ramps that were death traps around here. For you come down this incline, and then it does a 180-degree turn, and you've got a wall. If anyone ever lost control of their wheelchair, they'd be going into a wall, kind of thing. And that persisted for decades. And finally, with this latest round of renovation, which, by the way, was hell to work through. I worked through a year and a half of it before I retired, and then when I came back and teach, there were jackhammers going and stuff, sometimes outside your classroom, which was very inconvenient at the time. And I know that people were playing musical rooms and for offices and classrooms and so on for a period of about 3 years. But now I come on campus, and it's just a whole different feeling. Driving on campus, even the parking lots are different. You don't have this straight row aiming at the prison looking thing. You've got the road that comes in and kind of feeds you into a really decent parking area, and you've got the new library facility, and then they really did, in addition to totally ripping the guts out of every building and replacing everything, so that the air handling systems work and stuff like that. The look of the place, I think, is, and I'm not a big fan of sheet metal, but I think some of the way they've used a combination of metal and masonry has broken up the monotony of the facades, and this building now has an elevator in it so that it's handicap accessible, and I think there's an elevator over in the science building, and I don't know if there is in building 1 or not. But
yeah.
Okay, so
and indoor stairs.
Well, they've eliminated a lot of the stairs too. Building 1 always had indoor stairs, but building 3 never did, which was sort of incredible. And actually, I guess this building didn't either. I had to go outside to go from the upper floor to the lower floor in this building. So there's been a tremendous advance in handicap accessibility, and just access. I mean, in general, and the classrooms now are integrated where you do have better audiovisual capabilities, and you can tie in, link in with the net on your computer in the classroom if you want to show something that's on, online or whatever, and so I really I think that what's happened with the latest round of renovations has turned this into a much more attractive and functional campus. I mean, you initially you came out and there's just a series of stairs. Now there's sort of a winding walkway, that is much more pleasant.
It's aesthetic, yeah.
Less concrete, more green, more nice big boulders on the green hills. I still have some concerns about whether we should have spent millions of dollars to build a whole new facility 12 miles away, when most research suggests that when you have satellite campuses, they should be 25 or more miles away. And that was another one of those administrative things that I think was done for political reasons. There were board members that felt they had to have a site in Prescott Valley, which is a 10-minute drive. I lived there for 17 years, and I always wondered, if someone can't drive 10 minutes to come to school, I'm not sure that they're highly motivated. But they built a center out there at the cost of millions of dollars. They built a center out in Chino at a cost of millions of dollars, and I don't know. I guess there are people who are greatly in favor, and maybe I'm just being a Scrooge, but I wonder sometimes whether, particularly the Prescott Valley one, that's really close, and I think maybe more should have been done out in the Cottonwood area, where it's really a ways away, and is really a satellite or a whole different. Now it's basically an independent campus. They really resent it when we talk about the little campus in Cottonwood, and I don't really talk that way anymore. It used to be a little campus with a couple of temporary buildings, but that was another one of those kind of administrative decisions about allocation of resources that people can still argue about, where a lot of people thought, well, why do that? Why not enhance the overall campus here? I mean, a 10-minute drive is not a huge burden. But it's done, and it's there, and it's used, and that makes people feel better, in those communities and stuff. So I guess for political purposes, that was a savvy thing to do. I was always one of the ones who was a little skeptical about, not that it was convenient. I've taught at both of those sites, and it was nice for students to only have to drive for 2 minutes instead of 10 minutes. But I always wondered whether that was a good allocation of resources, especially when there were so many problems on this campus with just basic structure and the physical plant and things not working and leaking and stuff like that. So after the fact, when it's all done, what we see here, I think is really just a huge improvement, and it's too bad. It might have even been better if we hadn't have kind of trickled money off into what may be unnecessary facilities, only a 10-minute drive from campus. So I'm one of the ones who are willing to speak out and say that that may have been a bad idea, and it really was politically motivated. There were a couple of board members who really wanted to be able to go out and tell their constituencies, we got you a center out here. And and I don't think that's necessarily the best way to make educational decisions.
No.
And I observed that going on. And at one point, one of those board members claimed to be involved, be upgrading his education by being involved in a particular program on the college, and I knew he wasn't. And I even checked with the registrar's office, and this was during an election cycle, and part of his electioneering was say, I'm really involved. I'm involved in this program, taking courses at the college. And I called the newspaper and said, I'm a division chair here, and I want to tell you that this board member is lying, and he's not enrolled, has never been enrolled at the college, and is lying to people about about what he's doing here. And there was another faculty who kind of got involved in that as well, and had if that guy could have gotten me fired, he would have. He also lost the election, and I'd like to think I played some small part in that. He was someone that I felt was very he was one of the ones that was responsible for some of those political educational decisions, and I occasionally have done things where I've gone home and told my wife, I may have done it this time, and I may not have a job, but he tried to accuse me of libel or something. It's true, it's not libel. And
voters tend to not like people who lie to them blatantly.
Yeah. And so anyhow, he came in and complained to the Dean of Instruction, and the Dean of Instruction at that point in time said, well, these people have freedom of speech, and the fact that I work here doesn't mean I can't. And I made sure that what I got was not confidential information. I checked with the registrar, and I said, is this public information, whether someone has ever been enrolled here or not? Not what their grades are, or anything like that. He said, yeah, public information. I said, good. And so that, relating to, one of the reasons that I went after that guy is I felt he was trying to politicize educational decisions and even how money was spent and so on. So I was willing to go after him, and I felt that was appropriate. And like I say, I was sweating whether or not he was, if he had gotten elected, he probably would have been able to try and put pressure. Although I'd been here long enough, it would have, they would have had to come up with some reason to get rid of me. But it's sometimes people just have to take a stand and speak truth to power. Is one of my good friends here, a philosophy instructor, Nina Perlmutter, one of her sayings that I really believe in, that you do have to speak truth to power. And stuff.
Well, there's, I guess, I don't know if it was a year or two ago, there was an Arizona legislator that wanted to make it a punishable offense to share opinion, for a teacher to share his or her opinion in the classroom. It got struck down, but do you have any thoughts on that, or have you ever, has the administration or I guess mood of the college ever suggested that teachers should censure their opinion?
Well, and that's that's a tricky area, because there's a concept called academic freedom, which means that you have the freedom to espouse, even unpopular views within the context of your area of expertise. And so, for example, in this community, there are a lot of people that really get incensed if you talk about evolution. But as someone with a background in some degree of science and sociology, although we're not biologists, but we look at the debate about evolution and what it involves. And in fact, I've taught the class called Evolution and Creationism. I developed the class. So in that context, I can present very unpopular views in this community about evolution, because it falls within my area of expertise. I'm not at liberty to stand up and say that I think President Bush is an idiot and a war criminal. Now, I may think that, but in the context of what I say in class, I can't do that. Now, maybe if I'm a political science instructor and have in the context of my background and what presidents have done and what some of the legalities and attacks on constitutional provisions and so on, that might be appropriate to say that this president has been a huge threat to our constitutional protections of privacy and free speech and stuff like that, and be able to put that in a academic context to show how the Patriot Act, has affected our privacy and the ability of people to spy on our telephone conversation or something. That I can bring into a classroom, even in sociology, in the context of how governments work and that sort of thing. But I'm not free to espouse my opinions about whether a president is good or bad or indifferent or whatever, just because they're my opinion. And I certainly could not talk about an upcoming election, about who people should vote for or anything. Now, come the bell and I step out into the hallway and a student asks me that question, I have the same rights anyone else does to speak of that. But that's one of those areas where I think sometimes some instructor may have gotten carried away and just brought personal opinions that had nothing to do with what was being taught in the class. There's no academic context for a comment. That sure has happened, but I don't think it happens a lot. I don't think it happens enough to make it illegal.
Yeah.
Because it really does. It really could have a chilling effect on what people would be afraid of. Gee, what if I say something that someone construes as being forbidden or whatever. And I know after 9/11, we were talking about values in a class, and the president was getting up and say, "Here are people that hate freedom." And I said, let's analyze this comment. These people, he said, they hate us because we're free. I said, could there be other reasons that these people might hate us? Is it possible that we have behaved in a way that has harmed some of these people and they feel that this is some kind of retribution? Does it have to be that they hate freedom, or it could be they just hate us as a society for what we've done? And I actually had some qualms about introducing this line of discussion into the class because people were very uptight about that. But I said, hey, we've got to stop and think that no one in the Twin Towers, none of those individuals were specifically deserving of being killed, and that sort of act is always reprehensible, whether they do it or whether we do it. And we've killed a lot of civilians in our activities around the world over the years. The CIA, I've heard CIA operatives suggest that the Americans are responsible for 2 or 3 million deaths in the latter part of the 20th century, and so when that happened, I brought up the discussion in the context of what might be a motivation for someone to want to attack us in this way, and are they
you mean other than jealousy?
Other than jealousy over our freedom, could it be that they had grievances and that they felt that they were attacking? The World Trade Center was kind of the symbol of the American domination of the world economically, and I mean, could you, if not condone, because I don't condone it, and I don't want anyone on this tape to think I condone it, but can you understand how people might be driven to those radical kinds of behaviors, and that it's not that they are inherently just evil and so on, but are driven by their interpretation of history and their understanding of it, and driven to do what is a despicable act, but not necessarily an act that is totally understandable. And I introduced that discussion within the week after 9/11, and no one complained about it. I was able to do it in such a way as to get people to think about it. But there was a professor somewhere else in the country that said, "Well, those people deserve to die." and this guy, I think, was eventually drummed out of his professorial position, or at least there were efforts made, and that, I think, was a different kind of statement. I think you can understand why these people did this, and understand that they were actually operating from a values system. And that's where I was trying to say, we have a value system, and just because someone's values conflicts with ours doesn't mean we don't have values. It just means they have different values. And I think sometimes legislators, I've heard it said that every society has to find a job for everyone, and even the retarded have to have something to do, and that's why we have legislatures. And sometimes you wonder, whether these people are retarded about, their knowledge about, how you educate and how you explore ideas. That comment in itself could be, I realize some people can find offensive, but I do it for illustration because for a legislator to say, well, there are certain things you just can't say in a classroom, is stupid. I think that you can say that if you go out and start espousing stuff in a classroom that has nothing to do with the content of the class, then you can be held accountable in your in your institution for not fulfilling your duty as an instructor to present material in your class that is appropriate, and that's a matter of academic integrity as well as academic freedom, and so I think that I'm glad that didn't get anywhere, and I think that people have to be careful in the classroom that they don't go off on a high horse with their own opinions that have nothing to do with what they're teaching.
I think Florida's in danger of having history classes can only teach fact.
Yeah, and
Columbus sailed in 1492,
yes. And that is so stupid. And I always start off my sociology classes by defining fact, because people get hung up on this idea. And my definition, I remember it verbatim. Sometimes I'd write it out on the board because students kind of look stunned. That a fact is a particular ordering of reality based on a theoretical interest. And because facts are meaningless unless they're in a context. And, the fact is America contributes more money to the United Nations than any other country. Therefore, the U.S. is the most generous country in the world, right? Actually, the U.S. contributes the lowest level of its GNP of any other industrialized nation. So really, we're the stingiest country in the world. Now, which is the fact? I mean, is the fact the amount of money, or is the fact the context? And so the idea, I once had a student come to me and said, I'm going to do really well in your class because I deal only in facts. And I said, well, you may find that sometimes facts can be misleading, and you have to have interpretations of facts. And the student actually didn't survive the class because they were so rigid with facts. And I think that in the social sciences in particular, the idea that you deal with facts is ludicrous, because the facts are embedded in a context, and people will cherry pick bits of data. I mean, if people actually dealt in facts in terms of its context, I can buy that theoretical interest. You see administrations presenting facts about Iraq, and that are rooted in their theoretical interest, and you see other people presenting, taking those same facts and saying, well, that may mean something entirely different. And
Bill O'Reilly, Michael Moore.
Yeah,
they look at facts in different ways.
Michael Moore, I think, tweaks facts. Bill O'Reilly makes some up. From what I've seen, it's just flat out lies. I think that Moore has massaged them, although I've watched all of his movies, and the worst I can say is he's juxtaposed some things inappropriately, but he's never out and out lied. And I've seen Bill O'Reilly out and out lie. So, but people have, certainly they can play fast and loose.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I try and do in terms of teaching in the social science area is to get people to understand that one of the reasons you need to be educated is to develop a better crap filter, because there's so many people out there trying to feed you a line of crap. Whether it be our current president, and presidents lie. I don't know of any president that hasn't lied to some degree, although maybe what they lied about, Clinton lied about his sex life, and I found that somewhat despicable and disgusting, but no one died over that lie. President Bush lied about the need to invade Iraq, and people have died over that, and I pointed out in my class that all politicians lie, but sometimes their lies have different consequences. Mm-hmm. And I always pointed out that our engagement in Vietnam historically was rooted in a lie.
Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, the Gulf of Tonkin crisis. I was on duty the night of the Gulf of Tonkin attack. At a site where we were getting the relays of the radio messages from those destroyers. Mm-hmm. And so I know the attack occurred. But I also I worked in a facility where we had Navy personnel, Army, Air Force, and Marines. And I mentioned one of the Navy guys. And he says, how could the North Vietnamese be stupid enough to try and attack one of our destroyers with PT boats? And our destroyers had radar-guided gunnery and all this sophisticated stuff. Those PT boats didn't stand a chance. And he just laughed. He says, that was one of our boats. And by that, I knew what he meant was those boats were intelligence gathering craft, and they routinely, what they would do, one of their activities was to penetrate the territorial waters of North Vietnam for the purpose of generating a military response, because these boats were packed with listening devices. And one of the ways you find out what an enemy's capability is you tweak them a little bit, by posing a threat, and then you see how long it takes them to respond. What radars come up, what military units will respond, and how fast, and so on. And that these ships had been engaged in some of that kind of activity, clearly violating the waters of North Vietnam and purposefully producing military response. And of course the president got on TV and said our ships were engaged in innocent passage out in the middle of nowhere near North Vietnam, and told Congress that, and Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And over 50,000 Americans died over that lie. And I know, and I was there, and I was working in military intelligence, I know it was a lie. And I think it's the same kind of lie that Bush told. And, we've only lost 3,800 Americans, with tens of thousands coming back physically and mentally maimed, however. I mean, the number of casualties is
so
far more than the 3,800. I think it was 3,880 when I saw it on TV last night, something in those areas. But there probably will have 100,000 people whose lives have been seriously damaged just here, and millions. I mean, there are millions of refugees we've created over a lie. And where someone took made up their facts. So facts are dangerous things. Mm-hmm. When they're not in context. I'm probably giving one of my in-class spiels, but I think that's kind of thing you can discuss in class, mm-hmm. because it's looking at what happens in governments and so on, and how governments manipulate their own legislatures or their population to support a war.
As a faculty member and an administrator, have you ever had to deal with complaints from students, or in some way where you as a faculty rein in another faculty member who maybe went too far, or spoken to a faculty member?
I've had to talk with faculty who may have been insensitive to the needs of some of their students who may have been handicapped or something. Very often I would find when I investigated a student complaint that really the student was just trying to get away with something, and that would come out. But whenever I had student complaints, I would investigate it as best I could with the student, but I'd always bring the faculty member in and the student and say, all right, let's discuss what happened here. And there was one instance where I did actually have to essentially reprimand a faculty for particular behavior that was inappropriate, had nothing to do with academics or whatever, but based on a number of student complaints. But so that could happen, and student complaints weren't just blown off. But I found the majority of student complaints where a student was unhappy with a grade, thought they were being treated unfairly, something like that, and those were usually dealt with by getting the student and the instructor together to make sure that they were the student was clear on what the requirements for the class were, and sometimes the student would say, well, they never told me this, and the instructor would say, well, here's the syllabus I handed out on the first day, and here it is in bold and underlined, what these requirements will be, and the student claims they never heard of it. And I'd show that to the student, they go, oh, I forgot about that. And occasionally there were situations where students were accused of cheating. We would deal with that and stuff. So those were rare instances. But they would come up. I occasionally even had a parent come in, and I try and explain to the parent that we're trying to treat your child as an adult, and having you come in as an intermediary really is not allowing them to fulfill themselves as an adult. And I would try to keep parents out of these situations, because I do feel it's inappropriate for a parent to be coming in and saying, you treated my baby badly, kind of thing.
Well, I've, as a future high school English teacher myself, I hear a lot of the, stories about parents coming in and, being very adamant about their child getting a better grade. And do you, beside that one parent coming in, do you see the effects of that in the classroom later with, a student, I don't want to say who's spoiled, but a student who's been, I guess, coddled a little too much? And
well, I think that is actually a fairly broad thing, because I think I'm not sure that high school always does a good job of preparing students for college. And I think students sometimes come to college thinking that they shouldn't have to do any more work here than they did in high school. And those students are sometimes very resentful and think they're being overworked, and will complain. I've had students complain about the workload, and generally I would point out, well, there's a rule of thumb at the college university level that for every hour you spend in class, you should be spending 1 or 2 hours outside of class. And are you doing that? Well, it's always obvious they aren't, and there are very few students that spend 2 hours outside of class for every hour in, for example, which has always been the rule of thumb. I always felt lucky if I got an hour for the assignments I've given and the readings and stuff like that. But I think it's an ongoing problem, and I think part of the adjustment for students coming to college is that adjustment of taking responsibility for your behavior and appreciating that when an instructor says you should read a chapter and stuff, that they do that for a reason. And I always try to give my students some guidelines about how to study and about how to read a textbook. And you don't just read it and close it. There are ways of reading a textbook so you get more out of it. How to underline a textbook, how to take notes, how to use the summary. And that first year or two of college, I think there's a lot of learning that students need to engage in so they can really be good students. I mean, some come in doing it well, but and sometimes you just have to kind of roll your eyes and go, geez, what are they here for if they don't want to do the work? And I actually, in the Western Civ class, we used to have students, they would come in for 2 hours of lecture and then 2 hours of discussion. Then we would have a discussion section. And so they were actually getting 4 hours of instructor time, even though they were only paying for a 3-credit class. And they would complain that, we only signed up for 3 credits. Why are you making us do this extra hour? And we would try and say, well, wait a minute, you're getting that much more for your money. But their idea was, we want to get through on the minimum amount of effort. And I would try and turn that around and say, no, you're getting more than what you paid for, because you're getting us for an extra hour of discussion. And that should be to your advantage. You shouldn't. And so many students would think we were somehow abusing them because they had to attend 4 hours of this class to get 3 credits. Of course, you do that in the sciences all the time. And we figured that the discussion section was like a lab in a science class. And I was always kind of bemused at that attitude that they wanted to get by with the minimum amount of effort rather than they were really here to learn something. And I'd get students, you just wonder if they were in the same universe. I remember, after a lot of discussion of post-World War II world, and you hear a lot about NATO now in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and I gave a quiz, and I said, what's NATO? And had one of my students tell me that NATO was the Japanese emperor that made their pilots fly kamikaze missions.
It's creative.
I think of where have you been? This is a student that obviously wasn't taking advantage of all the extra time we were spending on this class trying to get them to understand.
Wasn't that Hirohito?
Yeah,
Hirohito.
And stuff.
Sorry.
But it ended with an O. I mean, so and we just covered World War II. And that's not to say that that all students are lazy, but I think that it takes a while to get students into the mindset that college is analogous to a job. And how many jobs are you successful in where you go in saying, I'm going to do the absolute minimum I can get by with? And so often when there are at least a proportion of students in every class that I've ever taught that kind of have the idea, I'm going to get by with the minimum. And it's trying to get those students to buy into the values of education, and it's can actually be fun and interesting to find out something about how the world around you works.
Bettering yourself.
And being a good citizen and understanding what's going on politically, and just understanding an advertisement and how people are trying to manipulate your behavior on TV and in radio. And I mean that is all part of being an informed citizen who just doesn't believe everything he's told and doesn't just jump up and salute every time a government official says this is the way the world is. I mean, that's part of what created that inconvenience they called World War II. When you had a whole society that was willing to follow an evil leader, and people says, he's our leader, so we have to follow him. And I think that part of our education should be to get people to be skeptical of all claims of authority until that claim of authority is demonstrated to have some legitimacy. And being in the social sciences, that was always one of my goals, was to get people. I used to carry a button when I was in the mood that just said, question authority. It's what our society is rooted in. And now if people question authority, they're accused of being unpatriotic.
Yeah.
And I think that the most unpatriotic thing you can do is to send our young soldiers into an unnecessary war.
Yeah, a phrase that Dr. Fisher's wife, Joni Fisher,
I know
who
Joni,
you
yeah.
know, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I like her phrase and use it a lot of being highly suspicious.
Yeah.
You know, always be highly suspicious.
And be incredulous. I think one of the problems with our society are people are too credulous. That is to say, they'll believe anything. And I remember during the Vietnam War there were some problems with this, and I still recall an interview I saw, and it made it to TV, where a young captain in Vietnam, there was the backdrop was a burning village, and the captain was talking to the reporter saying, well, we became aware that this village was coming under the influence of the Viet Cong, and so in order to save it, we had to destroy it. And
makes perfect sense.
Yes, and it just and I've always remembered that as that when people can believe that makes sense, they'll believe anything. And I hear I think there's been a lot of that kind of rhetoric going on the last few years. In order to preserve freedom, we have to take your freedoms away. And it was Benjamin Franklin, I believe, and it was a rough quote, that those that will give up will give up freedom for security deserve neither freedom nor security. Mm-hmm. Something, and that's a paraphrase, but
I've heard that.
I'm a firm believer that, in fact, I've even in class suggested that America has become one of the most cowardly societies on the planet because we're willing to give up a lot of freedom for just a little bit of security, and that's a cowardly thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people will, again, that's one of those things that I've said in class that I think could incense someone, but I think I have a right to say it in the context of, we're looking at how the society works and how people perform and how people influence other people's behavior. And if you can be frightened into giving up your freedom for just a little bit of security, is that how politicians operate? Is that how are you going to be influenced by that?
Well, now it's getting I don't know, scary for me because there's certain political media types will start using buzzwords, like liberal is a buzzword. That causes
I'm proud of being.
reaction.
I'm a liberal, and I progressive is now what liberals use because that word hasn't got the connotation. But I think that the conservative, especially the radical conservatives, have engaged in a campaign for the last couple of decades to make liberal a dirty word. And when liberal really means weigh the evidence before you act, and don't accept authority unquestioningly, and a few things like that. It certainly doesn't mean tax and spend. I mean, we've got a conservative government that's run us into more debt than any other government in history, and they still accuse liberals of being the spendthrifts. Mm-hmm. And as opposed, liberals are accused of tax and spend. I guess conservatives now can be accused of borrowing and spending. They don't even pay for what they're doing with taxes. They just borrow it and leave it to the next generation. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a real danger of people getting caught up in these buzzwords and stuff. Yeah.
What I see as a scary new buzzword as far as education goes is critical thinking is now a buzzword or buzz phrase that people are associating with liberal professors, and critical thinking apparently is now being synonymized with like brainwashing of students. You can't teach critical thinking; you have to teach facts.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most dangerous things that we can engage in, because critical thinking is questioning authority, and it is making sure that you have some information before you come up with an opinion. I mean, I've actually told students in class, I can remember one time discussing homosexuality in a psychology class, and the student said, well, homosexuals are just this and that and the other thing, and which was all the stereotypes about homosexuals. And I said, well, what's your basis for having that belief? And he said, well, It's just I've always believed that. And I said, well, what you need to understand is that your beliefs are irrelevant to this discussion because you have no information other than your beliefs, and so you're irrelevant. I've told students that to their face in class, and so if you want to think critically about that, you have to be willing to look at what is the information. One of his things was the homosexuals are more likely to abuse children or something. That you look at the statistics on child abuse, and most child abusers are heterosexuals, and things like that. But yeah, this attack on critical thinking, I think, is an attack on thinking. If you will, there are people who are afraid of thoughtful people, and so being thoughtful is being tied in with being liberal. Mm-hmm. And we all know that liberals are evil, so we don't want people thinking too much, because they're liable to think things we don't like. And I watch Stephen Colbert a lot, and I think one of his quotes is that reality has a liberal bias, but that the conservatives don't like. But I think that any attack on critical thinking is incredibly dangerous, because the people who attack critical thinking are the people who will follow leaders like Hitler and Stalin and Bush. You say you have to follow unquestioningly, and you can't. You just muddy the waters if you think too much about it, and you're being unpatriotic if you don't just do what you're told. We've gone through some episodes of that. We imprisoned tens of thousands of loyal Japanese Americans during World War II, and there are people who were told you were unpatriotic if you opposed that. And we went through a spate in the 1950s where you were unpatriotic if you didn't think that the Soviets were the most evil people in the world, and people lost their jobs and careers during the McCarthy era because they may have had the courage to think critically and question what certain people in authority were saying. And I think that the attack on critical thinking is an attack on what it means to be an American. Mm-hmm. We were rooted in being questioning authority and being revolutionary and not just going along with what we were told. And now, if you do those very things that were the virtues of our founding fathers, you're accused of being unpatriotic, and it's dangerous.
The Patriots back then were, British loyalists.
Yeah. Really, if you from the British perspective, certainly, and mm-hmm. Our founding fathers were a minority for a long time, mm-hmm. But they were a minority who were willing to challenge authority, and they changed the world essentially. And I think we have to be very careful about thinking the majority even is always right. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes a majority of people supported slavery and some of these things. For a while, a majority of people, I think, supported the war in Vietnam, which is now seen to be just a huge fiasco. And we're still, I have a brother who was in Vietnam for 2 tours and is still suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome and can't get help from the VA and stuff like that. So this attack on critical thinking is an attack on the core values of America.
And being a republic and a democracy.
Yeah, yes. I think those are some of the core values. And people who claim to espouse, being patriotic are often the same people who are attacking the core values of what made our country great and maybe different from other countries. This whole issue of putting people in jail without any recourse, taking away habeas corpus, which is one of the things that we objected to with King George, to jail people indefinitely without charge, and that was one of the things that our founding fathers objected to. And now we have an administration saying, but because we're threatened, we have to give away away these freedoms and or these rights. And I think that if a right, if it goes away when you're threatened, I mean, it's when you're threatened when these rights are most important. And if they go away when you're threatened, they're never there.
Well,
really.
one of the interesting things that I'd read about one time, the extremist Muslims are kind of a minority within their own population as far as terrorism.
Extremists are always the minority. Yeah,
yeah, but back when the World Trade Center was originally bombed with a bomb in the basement
during the Clinton administration.
During the Clinton administration, the investigators actually used a different sort of interrogation where they said, we'll protect your family. We're going to take your daughter to the dentist. We're gonna help you, but you need to help us. And and they helped this person, and he then helped us turn around and prosecute and search out other members. And now we have kind of the opposite thing going, where we torture them and threaten them, and now all of a sudden terrorism has grown and swollen.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a question mark as to whether every other country in the world that has had terrorist attacks has treated it as a criminal activity, and it hasn't affected the core values of their society and stuff. We're the only society really that's said, well, this is a war, and because it's war, we can attack personal freedoms, and we can treat people in ways that would otherwise be unacceptable. And I think that if people buy into the idea that it's a war rather than a relatively small group of criminals who may be religiously motivated and that sort of thing, there's a difference in approach. And we've taken the war approach, which may end up creating more people that hate us and make us less safe than if we'd taken the criminal approach and cooperated with other countries and stuff like that. And so this whole approach of saying, well, we're at war and therefore we have to give up rights and protections and stuff like that may make us less safe, and as a society, I think we're less safe as a democracy because of these attacks on the basic principles that our society was founded on. Habeas corpus is one of the core ones that led to the revolution. And here we have an administration that's saying, well, we can't have habeas corpus. We can't give people a right to confront their accuser. We can't give them a right to a fair hearing and stuff like that. And, that is the kind of thing that Hitler did in subjugating Germany and getting Germany ready to start World War II. And I'm not embarrassed to make that connection. I mean, our administration likes to, equate Iran with Hitler, and I think that they maybe ought to look in the mirror.
Yeah. Well, maybe we got to this point by not teaching our students enough critical thinking and teaching them too many facts.
I think too many facts and not enough thinking about the facts is part of why people will follow a leader that just blatantly lies and creates their own facts and then says, well, because we created this fact, now you have to believe it as a fact. That's dangerous. And I think the core of what education ought to do is to get people to understand that, that facts only exist in a context and not in a vacuum, and that a fact that stands alone has no meaning whatsoever. And there are a lot of people that just can't handle that idea.
Well, it's difficult. It's not easy. And sometimes
and it shouldn't be.
People like things to be black and white and cut and dry. And
absolutely, and we've got a lot of black and white thinkers in a technicolor world, and that's why we're in Iraq right now. Is we had a lot of black and white thinkers in a technicolor world, and they couldn't see the nuances of what was likely to happen if we. And yet these same people are who supported our attacking a country that had really never done anything to us, can't understand why Turkey might want to attack the Kurds in northern Iraq when the Kurds, at least those extremist Kurds, not just the Kurds, but who have been killing people and on a regular basis, not a single attack. And we say, no, you can't do that. And what kind of example are we? I mean, they look at us and say, wait a minute, who are you to tell us we can't take care of terrorists in a neighboring country? I mean, you went halfway around the world to attack someone that had never even attacked you. I mean, if you want to attack someone, attack Saudi Arabia. Most of the 9/11 terrorists were Saudi Arabians. Mm-hmm. And we never attacked Saudi Arabia.
We'd be attacking your own economy.
Yeah, but, I mean, so give me a break, on this. It really is, it's crazy. I mean, it's just, you look out there and you go, how can people be buying this crap? And it's because they're not thinking, they're just believing what they're told. Mm-hmm. And my job is to make them skeptical. Or my job was. I'm pretty well out of it at this point. But,
well, it seems like you had quite a tenure.
I had a run at it. I had 25 years. And,
yeah.
Actually, I had longer than that.
Well, with the other school.
Yeah, I worked in another school for a period of time too. But I really have had a 35-year career in academia. But, so I'm willing to let other people do it. I just hope that they can, maintain the integrity of the educational institution, because I think if people can undermine the freedom of educators to really question and to explore and to think critically, then they will destroy the educational institution in the society.
The pendulum will swing back. But, well, maybe in the future still, if Brent ends up taking the next honors class over to China, they'll need to enlist your expertise.
I'd be willing to bone up on my Chinese
and
go take a trip like that, I think. It would, I'll have to admit, it would take some refresher, but at least I have an inkling of how the language works. But,
you could tell kids what's on the menu, at least.
I could at least tell them what was on the menu. I could probably, since I was in the Air Force and we were mainly intercepting Air Force communications, I could probably tell them a lot about how airplanes work in Chinese, or at least how aircraft communications works.
Yeah. But, well, I could have used a little assistance when I went over there and had chicken of indescribable flavor.
Indescribable flavor?
Yeah.
Sounds good, yeah.
Cold chicken with a head looking at me.
Oh.
But I got used to the heads after a little while.
After a while, yeah. Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for...
well, it's fun. I hope I haven't said anything too outlandish.
It's your interview.
Yeah.
You can say what you want. And
just as long as stuff isn't taken out of context,
Yeah. Well, there's always those non-critical thinkers who will, and, but...
because they're always good sound bites if you crop them just right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But, it's for a college, and hopefully the people who will see this will be critical thinkers.
One of my reputations was, I once had one of the administrators say that the reason we like to have you is you're willing to say stuff no one else is willing to say.
Well, there you go.
And that's what I think I tried to do, was to say stuff that everyone was thinking, but no one was willing to say. And that was what, I kind of prided myself in that. I think that I kind of miss being in a position to do that. My activity for this last week has been getting my firewood ready for the winter, so, which there's a certain satisfaction to chopping your own firewood. But,
oh, yeah.